Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd last May. The sentencing comes 13 months to the day since Floyd was killed. You'll recall Chauvin was convicted on 3 counts back in April. Prior to his sentencing, members of George Floyd's family, including his daughter Gianna, shared statements on how they've been affected by his death. We also heard from Derek Chauvin himself, along with his mother, for the very first time. CBS News correspondent Jamie Yuccas is in Minneapolis with the latest.
Derek Chauvin sat motionless as emotion poured out from the family of George Floyd.
I miss you and I love you.
Including Floyd's now 7-year-old daughter, Gianna. Her loss played out in court while other family members addressed the former Minneapolis police officer directly.
I wanted to know from the man himself, what were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck?
Our family is forever broken.
My family and I have been given a life sentence. We would never be able to get George back. I haven't had a real nice sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life.
Find the defendant guilty.
Chauvin was convicted in April on 3 counts, including second-degree murder. The searing images of the officer's knee on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes ignited a movement.
George Floyd!
Asked by Judge Peter Cahill if he had anything to say, Chauvin's comments were brief.
I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind.
Minnesota's sentencing guidelines for second-degree unintentional murder call for a 10 to 15-year prison term. The defense asked for Chauvin to be released on probation.
He's not coming into this as a career criminal.
But the judge agreed with prosecutors that Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority and that he treated Floyd with particular cruelty.
Most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family.
In the end, the sentence was 22.5 years.
Like the conviction of Derek Chauvin 2 months ago, today's sentencing is not justice, but it is another moment of real accountability on the road to justice.
Chauvin now has 90 days to file an appeal, which is almost certain. He also faces federal charges along with those 3 other officers. If convicted of those charges, he could spend the rest of his life behind bars. Lana?
Jamie, thank you. For more, I want to bring in Rebecca Roiphe. She is a CBS News legal contributor and former Manhattan prosecutor. Rebecca, the judge stressed that the sentence followed guidelines and was not based on public opinion. President Biden even said the sentence seemed appropriate. Can you explain more about how Judge Cahill made his decision and whether 22.5 years was expected in this case?
Yes, sure. So Judge Cahill has been careful throughout this trial, and I think the public spotlight has made him, if anything, more careful than he would otherwise be, and he's known to be a very careful and good jurist. So here's how it generally works. Minnesota is a sentencing guidelines state, which means that when somebody is convicted, they are not absolute or required, but the guidelines provide a range of sentences that are appropriate. And the guidelines take into account the criminal history of the defendant. So that means basically how many crimes has this person ever been convicted of before, and then the crimes that the person has been convicted of. So the judge starts with that guidelines range, and in this case, the guidelines range suggested 12.5 years. At that point, they consider what's called aggravating or mitigating circumstances. And what that means is there something that makes this offense worse, or is there something that makes it perhaps less bad, or there's something we should consider that makes this person less culpable? So after considering that, the judge then looks at all of these factors and determines whether or not to give a sentence within that guidelines range or to go above. And so, as you said, that sentence of 22.5 years is above the guidelines range by actually a pretty significant amount. I mean, 12.5 years versus 22.5, it's not doubled, but it's almost doubled. So that shows that the judge, and in his opinion, he states that he found there were certain aggravating factors that justified this upward departure, making the sentencing worse. And so he said that because that he found that there had been particular cruelty and because there was an abuse of authority in this circumstance, it warranted this higher sentence. And so, yes, I do think that the sentence is, it's significant and it's warranted in this case. And one thing to keep in mind is he was not convicted of intentional murder. He was convicted of felony murder, which essentially means that he killed someone while intending to commit a felony, in this case, assault. And for felony murder, that's on the high side of sentences and seems like a significant jail term for Derek Chauvin.
And Rebecca, what other conditions did the judge lay out during the sentencing?
So during the sentencing, he heard from, as many might have seen, there was moving speeches from Derek Chauvin's family, and then he also listened from George Floyd's family. Then he also listened to Derek Chauvin's mother, who spoke on his behalf. Derek Chauvin himself did not speak, and that's, in most cases, a defendant would speak, but in this case, they're extenuating circumstances because he still faces criminal charges in the federal system. So it might be dangerous for him to make statements at this point that could be used against him later. So he chose not to make a long extended statement and really merely just said that he sent condolences to the family. So during the proceedings, the judge was listening carefully and considering that along with the written submissions and made this decision as a result.
Well, can we expect Derek Chauvin will appeal the sentence? And if so, what would go into that process?
Oh, almost definitely he will file an appeal. Appeals are common in criminal cases, and success on appeals are rare. So, that's the odds that he's facing right now. Not great. But that said, there are some issues that arose, and most of those issues surround the question of how highly public and how media intensive this trial was. And were the jurors deciding based on fact, or were those factors, the media attention, affecting their decision? And so the appeal will focus on different issues. The defense repeatedly requested that the judge move this trial and sequester the jury, and the judge declined those requests. So that will certainly be a cause for appeal, as will the question of, if you remember, Representative Maxine Waters made some statements that were perhaps a little ill-considered when she said that she was hoping for a sentence or for a conviction, and a conviction was what she wanted and what would be just. And even President Biden made some statements. And so the question will be, again, did these jurors make the decision based on fact, or were they swayed by these external factors? Was there bias? And there are a number of other issues that the defense could raise surrounding those questions. And, that is his right, absolutely, and he will try. My guess is, given the odds, the chances of success are quite slim.
Rebecca, as you mentioned, Derek Chauvin also faces civil rights charges in federal court. What can we expect in that next in terms of that?
Right. So there are two things that we have to keep our eye on. One is the federal charges against Chauvin, and the other is the charges pending against the three other officers who were there at the time. So we have that trial coming up, and then we have these federal charges for civil rights violations. The charges there are based, most of them, on the same factual pattern, but claiming that this was a violation of George Floyd's civil rights, his right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, which involves the right to be free from unreasonable force. And so, that case will proceed, and he could get an additional sentence there. Now, one thing to keep in mind, as we have our eye on how many years Derek Chauvin is going to serve in prison, probably that sentence will run what we call concurrently, which means that it won't add to the number of years that he serves in prison. However, there's also another set of charges based on a 2017 incident in which he allegedly used force, hit a 14-year-old suspect with a flashlight during the course of an arrest. So that will also be tried later on.
Finally, Rebecca, how might Chauvin's case, conviction, and prison sentence impact other police brutality cases in the future?
Well, I mean, that's really hard to tell. I think that, the prosecution was very unique here in that it included a lot of police officers and a lot of experts who testified from within the police department. We saw them break with this normal code and really forcefully state that what happened here, what Derek Chauvin did, was inappropriate and not in keeping with the policy or expectations of the police department. So, I wonder whether we aren't going to see more of that than we have in the past, that this set a tone both for, bringing serious charges when there has been a incident, but also for pursuing those charges in a different way and different expectations from police departments, that we are going to uphold our own standards as police rather than keeping ranks or closing ranks around somebody who's clearly a wrongdoer.
All right, Rebecca Roiphe, thank you.
Thank you, Lana.